Hello and welcome to this video, which is going to be about the meta build for the Endless Archive, at least playing solo. So what is this build about? Well, this build is basically the only really viable build for getting far in the Endless Archive on a solo build that's not a Dragon Knight that can run endless sort of macro shield. So all the other classes that Dragon Knight basically needs to run some sort of variation of this build. And what is the build? Well, the build is a combination of Heart and Conqueror and Torugs Pact. So what is the point of running Heart and Conqueror and Torugs Pact together? Well, it is of course to buff our enchantments, and those of you who've seen my channel for a long time will know that I made this build a couple of months ago as sort of a healer troll build, and the idea here was to buff the weakening enchantment up to 806. And why is this such a good enchantment? Because 806 weapon spell damage, well, the bosses could potentially have thousands. You know, they could have 4,000, they could have 5,000, they could have 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11,000. Well, that has to do with how the math works in ESO. And this can be a little bit complicated, but once you get the hang of it, it's actually kind of easy to understand. So I'm gonna premise it with something that I've talked a lot about on this channel before, which is cost reduction enchants. So most people will know a magic cost reduction enchant has a value of 203, and that value is applied before percentage modifiers. So if you're playing a healer and you have 7% from Breton and you have something like 12-14% from your light armor, you're going to get in the ballpark of about 80% cost reduction, which means that 80% of that glyph is applied, but the last 20% is lost. So basically, you apply the 203 before the 20% cost reduction, 20% of the cost reduction is not applied on that glyph. But that also goes the other way. So a healer shouldn't really use magic cost reduction because they have so much percentage cost reduction. But what about a tank? So a tank might run Vampire Stage 3, which means that 203 cost reduction is applied before the 8% increase to the cost of the skill, which means that there's an 8% increase to the effectiveness of that cost reduction glyph, which means that the 203 cost reduction glyph actually reduces the cost of the skill by about 220. So it goes both ways. Flat cost reduction can if there's a lot of cost reduction, percentage cost reduction, it is worse. If there's a lot of percentage cost increase, it is better. Why is this important? Well, this is important because this math applies to every part of the game, which means that our weakening enchantment applies before the increases to weapon and spell damage on the bosses. Why is this important in the Endless Archive? Well, it's incredibly important. One, because there's a lot of enchantment buffs in here that can buff this weakening enchantment to be in the thousands. So this glyph can go, there's in total 5 enchantment buffs of 75%. So this glyph can go way up until the thousands. Very important here to note that it is additive with Torugs Pact, but it's multiplicative with the Heartland Conqueror's buff, which makes the trait 60% instead of 30%. But one, it can go into the thousands. Two, the source made a very, very big mistake when they made the Endless Archive. And this is, I think, because most of the math heads at source is not there anymore, because they wouldn't have made this mistake. So most raiders will know this, or most people will know this. There's a normal and veteran version of each trial, each dungeon, basically all PvE content except for the Endless Archive. And the difference between these two modes is that the normal modes, they will reduce the weapon and spell, base weapon and spell damage by a ton on the bosses, and then what they will do is when they make the veteran versions, they will boost the base weapon and spell damage of the bosses. And why do they do this? That they do this specifically so that something like a weakening enchantment, which reduces the weapon and spell damage, something like cowardice, as we see here on the corrupted pollen, that also reduces their weapon and spell damage, something like the old mending set that we know from Ethereal Archive, also reduces their damage by a lot more on normal than they do on veteran. The idea here is that They wanted these buffs and or debuffs to be powerful, but they also didn't want them to be too powerful in the veteran content, so they made sure to buff the base weapon and spell damage of the veteran content so that we didn't get the same benefit, because veteran was supposed to be a lot harder. But the versions of the bosses and the ads and everything we've seen in this archive are normal versions. So how do they tune these normal version ads and bosses for the higher arc? So let's say we get to arc 8. Well, they do that by the percentage modifier. So we might have an arc 1 100% modifier, and then we might have an arc 10 1000% modifier. I don't know exactly what the modifier is. The problem is this applies before, and that makes the idea of how they make the scaling completely destroys that. So one test I did was, for example, I had 3 buffs, or the enchantment buff. I can't remember the exact value on the weakening enchantment. And then, of course, I had esoteric, I had armor cap, I had block as well. So there's a lot of other mitigation. But I had a heavy attack from a boss that did 30 damage. And this was in around arc 5. So you imagine that's a 300% increase. So imagine we take this to arc 15. So they could have increased the percentage modifier by 10-fold. That would still be 300 damage. And that's nothing. That I heal more on any tick of my healing than I take in damage. And that's the problem. They made a mistake when they made this archive, because they didn't account for this. So this basically makes any boss fight really not worth fighting, because the boss is not doing any damage whatsoever. As long as you're running this build and you get a couple of enchantment buffs, you can basically just breathe through the first 9 arcs without really meeting anything difficult, except of course the problem by this, which is that you can only apply a weakening enchantment to one target. So what do you do on the trash? And that's where you can use something like the hardening enchant, and this is what you will see the streamer Decimus using. He's running this build and he's using hardening enchant, and then he runs the weakening enchant, of course, on the back bar here. So there's ways. And there's also another thing on trash, which is that all the trash that they imported into the Endless Archive, they took again from the normal versions of the dungeons, which are intended to be reduced by a lot by these debuffs. And you can use something like Corrupted Pollen, and you will see that your damage on trash goes down by, orders of magnitude. And that is kind of why this build is the only really viable build to run in the Endless Archive. You will often see people running as well charged. The other problem in the Endless Archive has to do with focused effort. Basically, in the focused effort is such a powerful trait that you don't need to build for damage at all. So as long as you get a couple of focused effort traits, you can just kill everything by just spamming this elemental susceptibility skill. You don't really need to run any other damage skill. You run the wall, of course, to proc your enchant, and you run your cloak to proc your enchant, but everything else is basically built around just applying status effects. And that is also why the Warden is so strong, because they have a passive that specifically gives you better status effects. So if you increase the damage of your still status effect by 746, this scales at the highest offensive stat. So you imagine you have a weapon damage glyph in here, you get a couple of enchantments, your weapon and spell damage going through the roof, and this passive is going to start doing a lot of damage. So this is why the Warden is so popular, because it has an increase to the status effect damage. Anyways, I think this was enough for this video. I know this video is not really in how I made the other videos, but I've been kind of frustrated because I feel like this way the Endless Archive is designed basically shoehorns into sort of wargaming the math of the game, instead of just using some creativity around the build, because they basically shoehorned the entire Endless Archive score pushing segment into running this build or running a DK with Magma Shield, and that's it. That's all that's viable for getting far. There's no other sort of variation of builds, at least for now. We've not discovered any other variation of builds, and that's just because of how strong these two are. Magma Shield, you're in Immortal, and with this build you can reduce the damage by such an enormous amount that there's no reason not to run it, and that is kind of frustrating. Again, remember, on the trash, use the Hardening enchant, and I would say if you want to watch someone play this build and play this build a lot better than I can, I would recommend watching Decimus, because he currently has the world record on the Warden running this specific build. But I also feel like it was okay for me to go and share it, because one, I made up this build originally a couple of months ago, and two, I feel like everyone is running this build by now, so it should also sort of be put out to as many people as possible so they know about it. And this is the build if you want to go far solo in the Endless Archive. This is the build you should run. It doesn't matter if you're Sorcerer, it doesn't matter if you're Templar, it doesn't matter if you're Nightblade, it doesn't matter if you're Necromancer, it doesn't even matter if you're an Arcanist. This build is the only really viable build to get far unless you're playing a Dragon Knight. And that was basic for this video. So to wrap up this video, I just quickly want to go through the build. Let's start off with the Superstar. As you can see, we have 3 heavy, 4 medium. We can see the skills here as well. We have reinforced on all the heavy pieces. Then we have sort of mix of sturdy and well fitted on the medium pieces, and then I have a single Divine here. Divine's also good because it buffs our Serpent and stamina recovery, but you probably want to have a good mix of sturdy and well fitted too. That's sort of better. In terms of the rings, the multi-enchantment you see here, of course multi-enchantment is the stat recovery, it's tri-stat enchantment, but then generally it's the recovery and not the cost reduction. It's just important to note that as well. You will often see people using this multi-enchantment. This is the Hakeji version, weapon version, which gives you both stamina and magicka. So you'll often see people running this back bar if you're running a weakening front bar. If you're running hardened, you probably want to run the weakening enchantment back bar. Some notes here about how we play. Well, one thing that's very important is to have the tri-focus slotted, so that all your magicka, or that you block with magic on the front bar. Why is this important? Well, we're running the Serpent Mondays for a reason. We want to have as much stamina recovery in there. That's all. So if you want to go for the vision priority, you want, of course, the enchantment buff, you want focused effort, but then the third priority is to get stamina recovery. And why is that? Well, the esoteric greaves tend to eat a lot of stamina. And this is why we want to buff our stamina recovery as much as possible to sustain these. But they also do a lot of damage mitigation, and this is very, very important, specifically on the trash pulls. So that's basically it. You want as much stamina recovery as possible. Why do you want that? Well, we want to sustain the esoteric environment grease. And that's basically it for the video. So if we look at the Superstar here, one thing to note is that I'm playing a Brethren, but you really want to play a Nord, and we will see that in a second when we buff up the build. So we go through all the important buffs and look at the Superstar. Again, we'll see with armor cap on our first off, but a Nord here would have also buffed up the physical resistance to be maxed. So Nord is the best in slot race, which it always is. I'm specifically playing Britain, and you can also play this build on a Britain. You will find that you have a little bit better magic sustain on a Britain, but you also take a little bit more damage. And that was basically it for this video, and thank you for